Hi, I recently ran across a comment in one of my videos that ran parallel to some of the thoughts I've been having about the infamous and somewhat beaten to death NAWALT. Uh, Beaten to death both by me in my videos, because I have to talk about it so often, and by people employing it. But let me start the video off by simply quoting the gentleman, and I think he's spot on with what he says. I quote, his name is, so I give credit to him, Lander Zoo. If NAWALT is true, and say 10% of women are not like most women, it's no consolation, because 100% of men are going to be competing for that 10% of women who are not like the vast majority of women. That 10% will perceive their value above the 90% of horrible women and will up their asking price. These 10% of women will only date the top 10% of men, brackets, based on wealth, power, fame, attractiveness, and brackets, and they'll jump ship as soon as a richer and better looking guy takes an interest, AWOLT. Now, there is a yeah, there are some parallels to what I've been thinking recently. What is this guy saying? Um, I think 90% is generous, but let's stick with the 90% number. Let's assume that 90% of women are like that, 10% are not. What he's saying, and what I would like to say, is that you're going to have virtually 100% of men, maybe 99% of men, striving for that 10% of women. So from the start, from the get-go, vastly, vastly outnumbered. Then uh, you're going to have the very harmful inter-male dominance hierarchy competition take place, in which we crawl over each other's corpses if need be in an effort to acquire female reproductive resources, because we perceive these women, this 10%, to be, well, not like that. Now, let me just add in the middle of this the caveat that uh, even if we're generous and say that 10% of women aren't like that, it's safe to say that detecting amongst in the masses, to use my uh, somewhat infamous microbacteria in a haystack analogy, detecting what may or may not be a woman who's not like that is nigh impossible. So that only adds to the difficulty level involved here. But um, that's right. So you'll have an incredibly large pool of men striving for an incredibly small pool of women, which will up women's value, those women's particular value, perceived or otherwise. And you will essentially end up with a lot of men failing and falling flat on their face. Um, some in an effort to, when having actually spied such a female, just being priced out of the market essentially at the outset. That there will be many of those, and we'll get to that in a second. But also the legions and legions of men who fall for the 90%, because it's well disguised, as it were. And so you'll have a lot of men jumping after women who are in fact not part of the so-called 10%, but part of the 90%, because they misperceive things and they fell for a trap, and they'll end up falling on their face hard. And we can put the blame on men as much as we want. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to do that. If a man is honest, has good intentions, I refuse, and is a forthright human being, I simply refuse to place fault at his feet, because he acted according to with in a manner with integrity, honor, honesty, and simply because he was deceived. There's something screwy about the whole system, it should be said, when you have to constantly be on the lookout for deception on the part of the other gender. But anyway, so it is very, very true that these 10% of women, they'll start looking at their own values being, well, much more valuable than it actually is. Now, I'd like to make a little analogy here. It's not perfect, but uh, let's say that automobiles were the equivalent of women in this case. and they were just as desired as women were. You know, it was seen essentially as some basic element to life. You can't live without them, supposedly. But let's assume, just like here, that the vast majority of automobiles were uh, it's out of the out of the price range of the vast majority of men. Let's say a genuinely good car cost at least $1 million, at least. Most men could not afford that, um, and so, or maybe 10 million. Who knows with inflation these days? And so you'll have a lot of men either working their way towards acquiring that kind of car, the quality car that actually works. But what you also have on the market, and what we have in the so-called dating market, is the kind of phenomenon where you see a lot of imposters, you know, fakes, cheap imitations. You'll probably, in such a society where the car is elevated, to say, to female status, you'd probably get a lot of so-called cheaper versions that men could afford. Men who would normally be priced out of the top-end car automobile market uh, would be buying pieces of crap that were sold as in fact quality, because even if you're going to sell a product that is much cheaper, you're certainly not going to say it's a cheap piece of shit. You're going to say, oh, it's just as good as the other stuff. It's just more affordable. And so you'll have a lot of, and these are, and the analogy here is that the men uh, dating, looking, searching within the masses of women, and basically looking for the cheap car product. It's not the same thing. Um, and then, of course, you'll have men, as just said, who will spend all their money, their time, their energy saving up or what have you in an effort to get that most expensive automobile. That's what they'll do. And they'll probably fail in the end because there are other men with even much more money who actually are not priced out of that market and will get it. Furthermore, what all this says about female character, as a rule, is that if indeed it's the case that these 10% of women will inherently perceive their value, or naturally perceive their value as going up because of their so-called rarity, if they choose to associate women with men who are in the dominance hierarchy on the top end in terms of power, wealth, and what have you, then then it says a lot about female character. Um, so I'm reluctant to use the phrase AWOLT, but just because I don't like being purely categorical or entirely categorical about everything. But there seems to be a lot of evidence for that, for AWOLT as opposed to, well, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for NAWALT, and there does seem to be a lot of evidence for AWOLT. But to summarize, let's look at the situation. Um, you'll have a large pool of men striving for a very small pool of women, locked locked in competition with each other. And some men have said this is a good thing, that we should compete against each other for the sake of women. I'm not going to address that in this video, but I don't think it's a good thing. And yeah, and then you'll have people falling by the wayside, men falling by the wayside because they can't acquire that 10%. There'll be cheap imitation automobiles, i.e. women, most of them, 90% of them. And I do think these numbers are generous, that will uh, seem okay and men will fall for it, but in fact, not okay at all. So it is a bit of a conundrum and a problem, but this is in essence what NAWALT really entails. And people who use it and advocate it are advocating more male-on-male competition that will result in almost certain failure. And it's not good for men, and it's not healthy, and it's not sound advice.